Teacher report, teacher report, teacher report. Learned about the Comstock Lode and the Transcontinental Railroad. The train changed many lives. Most of the buffalo died. Treaties were signed by both sides. But when they found gold, the treaty was denied. Teacher report, teacher report. Mariners at ease, here's our next adventure. All right, welcome back. So you can take a look at this map. Hopefully yesterday you got a chance to look at the Fort Laramie Treaty. There's a bunch of them spanning about a decade. But you see this map, and this is pretty much what the treaty lays out as far as here are your tribal lands. But let's compare that with the next map, which shows the tribal lands and also shows where the silver and gold are located. And so you'll notice that there's an overlap, especially in Colorado, Wyoming, South Dakota, Montana. And basically what happens is the United States signs a treaty, gives the Native Americans a certain amount of land, but then someone's going to find something valuable. In this case, gold. Later it can be oil. And when they find this valuable resource, they basically say, what treaty are you talking about? I didn't sign that treaty. That other guy signed that treaty or whatever. They give them the runaround and they're going to take the land and the resources. What do you think this is going to cause? Hold on. Conflict. You're right. Okay. So you have the Sand Creek Massacre and you have the Battle of Little Bighorn, which is super famous, right? The Sand Creek Massacre is particularly heinous because they're not necessarily just fighting the warriors. They're fighting the entire tribe, women and children. They are going to move them off their land. In the Battle of Little Bighorn, Custer, I guess, starts believing his own legend a little bit. He takes a small group against a large group and he expects success, but he doesn't find it. He's going to be routed. They're going to chase him down into the mountains and stuff like that. Okay. But even though, this is an important part that I almost overlooked. Even though Custer is defeated, the next year, the U.S. can just send another wave. And if that was defeated, they could send another wave. And they can just keep coming. And there's more people, and they can outlast. And they have a technological advantage, and they have an industrial advantage. And they can just outlast the Native Americans. Okay. The ghost dance. Some natives, they dream of returning to their old way of life. And they're trying to have these ceremonies, and they're trying to call to their ancestors, and they're trying to keep their way of life alive. And the Battle of Wounded Knee is when the United States tries to break up this ceremony, and it turns into a war. I shouldn't say war. It turns into a battle. Okay. The Dawes Act. Here's a video about the Dawes Act. The Dawes Act, from one perspective, people might think, from the European perspective, they might think they're actually doing the Native Americans a favor. But what it's really doing is it's taking this big piece of land that's always been a tribal land, and it's cutting it into little squares. And what they're going to do is they're going to give the Native Americans the land, and then whatever's left over becomes property of the United States. But what that does is it changes the Native American lifestyle. They have always been together, tribal, roaming, things like that. And now you're going to kind of break them up and put them on these little squares. And that's going to have an impact, and that's going to affect the Native American culture. Here's a little video about that.
The Indian may now become a free man, free from the thraldom of the tribe, free from the domination of the reservation system, free to enter into the body of our citizens. This bill may therefore be considered as the Magna Carta of the Indians of our country. Alice Fletcher.
In 1887, well-meaning reformers had persuaded Congress to pass the Dawes Act. It provided for each head of an Indian family to be given 160 acres of farmland, or 320 of grazing land. Then, all the remaining tribal lands were to be declared surplus and opened up for whites. Tribal ownership and the tribes themselves were meant simply to disappear.
The Dawes Act was a way to break up the whole tribal structure of Native American nations. Instead of saying you are a group of people, all of a sudden you are individual landowners, you are Americans. And so it was designed to break up community, to civilize people, make us farmers, and to also break up our tribal structure.
In 1889, the same year as the Oklahoma land rush, 2 Eastern women arrived at the Nez Perce Reservation in Idaho, determined to implement the Dawes Act. Alice Fletcher was a leader of the group that called itself the Friends of the Indians, a pioneer in the emerging field of ethnology and one of the architects of the new law. Her companion was Jane Gay, a sometime poet who had learned the art of photography to document their time with the Indians. They had come, they believed, to save the Nez Perce from themselves by dividing up their land and making them homesteaders.
Alice explained what she had called them together to hear, explained the land allotment, the meaning of citizenship, and her wish that the whole people would see the wisdom of the great change that she had come to bring upon them. Still a silence. The interpreter read the law and then sat down and waited. A little stir arose among the people, and at length one man stood up, tall, broad-shouldered fellow with an air of authority about him. He said, "We do not want our land cut up in little pieces. We have not told you to do it. We are content to be as we are." And a groan of assent ran along the dark line of sphinxes as the old man drew his blanket about him. "Our people are scattered," said another. "We must come together and decide whether we will have this law." She told them that there is nothing for them to decide. They have no choice. The law must be obeyed. Jane Gay.
Alice Fletcher immediately set to work marking off the new boundaries on the reservation. The Nez Perce came to call her the Measuring Woman. Chief Joseph himself came to pay a visit. After his long flight from the Army in 1877, he had been exiled to Oklahoma and then allowed to return to a reservation in eastern Washington, but not to his beloved homeland, the Wallowa Valley in Oregon. Using a new device, a wax cylinder, Fletcher convinced Joseph to record one of his traditional songs. But she could not talk him into taking an allotment of land.
He will have none but the Wallowa Valley from which he was driven. He will remain landless and homeless if he cannot have his own again. It was good to see an unsubjugated Indian. One could not help respecting the man, who still stood firmly for his rights after having fought and suffered and been defeated in the struggle for their maintenance?
Alice Fletcher kept at it for 4 long years, trying to divide Indian lands fairly, while fending off whites who sought to persuade her to leave the best land for them.
I'm nearly used up. I have such a hard time here, but I shall soon push through. My honor is involved in getting this done.
By the time she was finished, she had made more than 2,000 Nez Perce allotments, over 175,000 acres. Then she and her friend started east to Cambridge, Massachusetts, where Fletcher had been awarded a fellowship at Harvard's Peabody Museum.
In the week's journey home across the continent, we shall have time to review the outcome of our earnest endeavors. But if it has been well for us and well for the Indian, is not for us to know. We can only leave the question among the unsolvable, whose multitude grows ever greater as life goes on.
The Dawes Act, meant to help Indians, devastated them instead. In 1895, the remaining 500,000 unallotted acres of Nez Perce tribal land were declared surplus and opened for homesteading. By 1910, there would be 30,000 whites within the Nez Perce reservation, and just 1,500 Nez Perce. Across much of the West, the story would be the same. Before the Dawes Act, some 150 million acres remained in Indian hands. Within 20 years, 2/3 of their land was gone.